Chapter 10, The Flying Clipper, Wednesday, November 9th, 1892. It was an unusually warm day as Will walked along the New York dock with his knapsack and coat swung over his shoulder. The dock was busy with sailors and workers, and there were all types of ships from around the world. There were ships with sails, others powered by steam, and some with oars. Will looked at the different ships, searching for the name he had written on the paper in his hand. The Flying Clipper, there it was near the end of the dock. It had multiple masts for the sails, the bow was narrow and heavily raked or sloped forward, and one could tell it was built for speed. The term clipper originally applied to a fast horse, although some felt they were given that name because the vessels clipped time off a voyage. After admiring the size of the ship for a few moments, Will went up the gangplank to the deck, stopping two sailors as they were coming down to the dock. "Excuse me, but can you tell me where I can find Captain Patch Hawkins?" "Yes, he's in his cabin just below the bow," one of the sailors answered. "Thanks," Will said as he continued up the gangplank. He didn't want to show his ignorance by admitting he didn't know where the bow of the ship was. After standing there for a few minutes watching the activity on the deck, he decided to take a chance and walk to the front of the boat. He climbed down the ladder leading below deck. At the bottom he came to a door with the words "Captain" above it with letters made out of what looked like big teeth. Will knocked on the door, but it wasn't shut tight, and the knocking caused it to open. Standing at a table with maps spread before him was a handsome man dressed in a black suit with a white puffy shirt. He had long hair to his shoulders and a beard to his chest, just like Uncle Jim Perry's, and he was almost as tall as Will, probably about 6 feet 2 inches. There was a patch on his left eye, and instead of a right leg he had a round wooden peg. "Come in," the captain said. "How may I help you?" "Hello, my name is William Perry. Cookie Douglas suggested I come and see Patch Hawkins for a job on the ship, the Flying Clipper," Will answered. Cookie had told Will he had met the captain during the American Civil War when the captain's ship provided supplies to the troops. He also said the patch on the captain's eye was from an old war injury and the missing right leg was from a shark attack in the Bahama Islands. Cookie never knew what happened to the shark, but now Will could tell him he thinks he solved that mystery. The shark's teeth were being used over the captain's cabin door. "So, Mortimer sent you," the captain said, calling Cookie by his given name. "How's my friend doing?" he asked. "He's fine. He told me you have to come and visit him sometime," Will answered. "Mortimer knows I'm not coming that far inland. If I can't smell the ocean, I get land sickness. In other words, I get sick from not being on the sea," Captain Hawkins said, laughing. "So you want to work on my ship? I don't know if a railroad man will have the sea legs to be a sailor, but if Mortimer sent you, then I'll give you a chance. Go see the boatswain, Damon Andrews, and he will show you to your sleeping quarters. You should find him starboard. He will also assign your duties," the captain said, waving goodbye to Will and returning to his maps. Will left the cabin, closing the door behind him, and like he did when he was looking for the bow, he stood there for a moment trying to figure out where the starboard would be and who would be a boatswain. He realized learning the names of the parts of a ship and other nautical terms was the first thing he had to do. He climbed back up on the deck and started walking along the right side of the ship. He stopped and watched a stocky, muscular sailor giving others orders. When the man had finished, Will approached him. "Can you tell me where the starboard side of the ship is?" "You're on the starboard, matey," the man told him in a Cockney accent. "Then can you tell me where I can find boatswain Damon Andrews?" Will asked the sailor. "You're looking at him, matey," the boatswain said. "Captain Hawkins sent me to see you about a bunk and also to be assigned duties," Will said. "Well, follow me, matey. You can share my cabin. That's the only bunk available. You can take over the duties of my last cabin mate, who got married and has decided to stay home and start a family. Since it appears you don't know the names, it sounds like one of the first things I'll have to teach you are the parts of a ship," Boatswain Damon said, smiling. "I agree with you and was thinking the same thing myself," Will said, smiling back as he followed the boatswain. When they reached the cabin, Will was surprised at how comfortable Boatswain Damon had made it. The place reminded Will a lot of the way Cookie had given the cookie car a personal and homey touch. On a shelf, The only photograph was of a beautiful girl on a tropical island with a mountain behind her in the background. "Drop your knapsack and coat, matey," Boatswain Damon said. "Then follow me so I can take you on a tour and acquaint you with the ship and other important information that landlubbers should know about." We'll learn later that being called a landlubber wasn't necessarily an insult. It just meant an inexperienced sailor or one that was on their first voyage. Will smiled because he sure fit that definition. The first place Boatswain Damon took him was to the galley, which is the kitchen where the food was prepared for the crew. Next they went to see the hold of the ship where they carry the cargo for trading. The hold was empty now because the men had just unloaded all of the goods they brought back after their last voyage from Europe. While they were in the engine room, the boatswain told him that ships like the Flying Clipper were becoming outdated ever since the brief economic slump in 1857 and because of competition from boats powered by steam. Captain Hawkins didn't want to give up the Flying Clipper, so he added a steam-powered engine to use when the wind wasn't blowing very hard. The disadvantage of the engine was it required coal to keep it running. The more coal they had to carry, the less room there was for cargo they could trade. It was worth it, however, because of the extra power it provided. "There may be times when you are needed to help fire up the engines, matey, so I wanted you to see this room," Boatswain Damon told him. "I have experience working on engines. I have a friend named Henry Ford who taught me a lot about them. I've also cooked for the men on the railroad before, so I can also help in the galley if it's needed," Will said. "That's great to know. You sound like a valuable shipmate. It's always good when someone new comes aboard and can do more than one job. You will also learn a lot about sailing by the time this trip is finished," Boatswain Damon said. "For example, every cargo ship should have the plimsoll mark, which is a line on the side of the ship's hull. When the surface of the water reaches that line during the loading of cargo, it means the ship has reached its maximum safe loading level." "Why do they call it the plimsoll mark?" Will asked. Ship owners who wanted to increase profits used to load their vessels until the water would actually overflow the deck. Samuel Plimsoll, a member of Parliament in England, knew this was very dangerous for the crew. He realized this overloading could cause the ship to be unstable and, like they did many times, capsize when the ship was out to sea. In 1876, the Samuel Plimsoll Merchant Shipping Act was signed into law, which mandated the limits of how much could be loaded on a ship. This new law provided such an increase in safety and profits, even ships not subject to that law used the mark. The two men continued walking around the ship, while Boatswain Damon explained other nautical terms. Will already knew the deck meant the floor of the ship, and he had learned that the bow was the front and starboard was the right side. The boatswain told him the stern was the back, and the aft just meant in the direction of the stern. Boatswain Damon showed him the left side of the ship, where the ships came into port to load and unload their cargo. They were tied up with their left sides closest to the dock to prevent damage to the rudder, which is why the ship's left side became known as the port side. The port side, sometimes called the larboard, which referred to the loading side of the ship. He told Will if he heard the term amidships, it meant near the middle. The hull is the main body, and the keel was the beam running from the stern to the bow. The helm was the wheel for steering the ship, and the masts were the large poles on which the sails hung. While they were standing under one of the masts, Boatswain Damon said, "Another of your duties, matey, will be to help maintain the riggings, which is all the ropes and cables supporting the masts and sails, and sometimes you will also have to stand watch at night. When you are the watchkeeper, you have to record the speeds, distances, headings, tacks, and passage of time, which is marked by the sound of a bell every half hour. This information is then put on a slate tablet kept near the helm. If there are no problems during your watch, the slate has to be wiped off so that the new watch could start over with a clean slate. I will show you later how all of this is done." "I know you are called a boatswain, so what are your duties?" Will asked. A boatswain is often called a boatswain and is a member of the deck department of a ship. On naval vessels, the boatswain is a warrant officer or petty officer. I was born in England and became a boatswain with the English Navy. I kept that title when I started working with Captain Hawkins. A boatswain on a merchant ship, like the Flying Clipper, is the foreman of the ship's deck crew and he's sometimes called the third or fourth mate. Captain Hawkins has appointed me to be second in command on his ship, and I'm in charge of supervising the crew, the maintenance of the vessel, and the supply stores. Every morning I have to inspect the entire ship, including its riggings and sails. If there is a problem with any of these, I must report immediately to the captain. I make sure the crew weighs or raises the anchor when we depart and lower it when we dock. Overseeing the raising and lowering of the sails are also part of my responsibilities, the boatswain Damon said. He shared other important information about the Flying Clipper with Will. For example, she was 2,800 tons, 210 feet on the keel, and 230 feet on deck. The ship was 44 feet wide, and the depth of the hold was 22 feet, including 7 feet 10 inches of height between decks, which Will really appreciated because, like the captain, he was tall. Captain Hawkins really takes care of his ship. Everything is so clean and in order. He sure looks like he runs a tight ship, Will said. He does, but he is a good captain. He just likes everyone to do their job. He knows if we work as a team, we can get to the different ports around the world fast. Getting to ports quickly really became important, especially when the Sino-American Treaty of Wanghia was signed between the United States and China on July 3, 1844, opening several ports of trade for American vessels. Tea, silk, and other products from China were now available for American traders, Boatswain Damon said. The fastest vessels to arrive in port and return with the goods had the highest profit margins. The textiles and tea also could get mowed if they didn't get to market quickly. The captain knows people work harder if they have an interest in the profits, so he gives each of us shares depending on our position and duties on the ship. He gets 20 shares, I get 10, the rigger 5, cook 5, and the 18 sailors or hands get 3 shares each, with the final shares invested by the crew in purchasing more cargo and keeping the Flying Clipper shipshape. Well, you won't have to worry, I'll earn mine, Will assured the boatswain. Just then the captain came up to them. Boatswain Damon, please blow your whistle. I want all hands on deck. Boatswain Damon blew his shrill boatswain's whistle 3 times, and the men began coming from all over the ship. Once they had towed the line in front of the captain, Boatswain Damon started doing a head count of the sailors. All the men are present and accounted for, sir, except for the 2 crew members, Matthew and Joseph, who are arranging for delivery of the cargo that we will be taking when we leave port, the boatswain reported. I'll brief them later, the captain said. He turned to the gathered crew in front of him. Men, first I want to introduce you to our newest crew member, William Perry. All the men waved to Will as the captain continued. I've been mapping out our next route. We are going to go along the United States coast to the West Indies in the Caribbean Sea, trading as we go. From there we will go over to the South American coastline, then around Cape Horn, which is at the southern tip of that continent. We are heading to San Francisco and then across the Pacific Ocean to Tahiti, with China being our final destination. This is an important journey, and the profits could be high, so time is of the essence. Thank you. Captain Hawkins saluted the men, then turned to Boatswain Damon. As soon as the lumber arrives, let's get this ship loaded. Remember to pay attention to the plimsoll mark. He then retreated to his cabin to finalize the route the ship would be taking. The men headed back to their posts and prepared for their departure. Will looked at Boatswain Damon. The West Indies, South America, San Francisco, Tahiti, and China. I can't believe this. When I was young, I always dreamed of going to faraway places, Will said excitedly. He knew the boatswain had been to a lot of places, but for some reason he didn't seem too happy, so Will asked, "What's wrong, boatswain?" "I'm not that excited about going to Tahiti," the boatswain said. "I have memories of that island." "What happened there?" Will asked with concern. "I'll tell you sometime, matey," Boatswain Damon said. "Right now we have to make sure the ship gets loaded." As they turned to go to the larboard side of the ship, 2 men came up the gangplank. Will recognized them as the 2 sailors who had given him directions to the captain's cabin when he first came aboard the Flying Clipper. "We have just returned from the train station across the street where the lumber just arrived. Once it is unloaded, the lumber will be brought over immediately," one of the men said. "I'll go below deck and open the portholes so the lumber can be put through," the other man said. "Thanks, mates. I'll assemble the crew to help so we can shove off by this evening. By the way, I would like you to meet Will Perry, our newest shipmate," the boatswain said. "Will, this is Seaman Matthew and Joseph." "Hello, Will," they both said as he shook Will's hand. "After you have the cargo ready, the captain wants to see both of you to be briefed on our destination," Boatswain Damon instructed them. When the lumber arrived, the boatswain, Will, and the rest of the crew began loading the ship's hold. They worked together, passing the boards from one to the other. Will was impressed with the efficiency of the loading and how well the men worked together. They began singing a sea shanty, which is a shipboard working song. The songs have a practical purpose because the rhythm of the singing helps to synchronize the movements of the crew. The shanties are also sung by the men when they are bored or to prepare themselves for a hard task ahead. Will happened to notice as he was passing one of the boards that the stamp on the end was the letters HF. He couldn't believe it. HF, Henry Ford? This lumber was from Henry Ford's Timberland, and he had helped harvest it. When he told Boatswain Damon, the boatswain shared in Will's disbelief. "Life is sure funny sometimes, isn't it, matey?" Boatswain Damon said. "I'll bet you would have never thought the logs you had cut in Michigan would end up on the docks of New York City." "No, I sure wouldn't," Will said, "and now I will be involved in delivering them to the islands in the Caribbean. I can't wait to tell my good friend Henry Ford next time I see him." The loading of the ship was completed ahead of schedule, and Captain Patch Hawkins wasted no time in ordering Boatswain Damon to weigh anchor. The flying clipper slowly eased out of its boat slip into the New York harbor. The captain wanted to reach the open sea before unfurling the sails to head south. There was a full moon, and the sky was clear and the water calm. The flying clipper sailed through the waters, hardly leaving a ripple in her wake, and the only sound that could be heard was the low rumble of the engine as they made their way to the mouth of the channel. Will stood on the deck, looking at the full moon and star-filled sky, thinking of the various life adventures he had up until now. He remembered when he was young, sitting on his favorite tree branch in the old oak tree back home, daydreaming of a moment like this. He thought of the dreams he shared with Sophie Clare at school and Mary Jane McCurdy in Amherstburg, and now those dreams were becoming a reality. "Hey, matey," a voice shouted, abruptly ending Will's thoughts. "Come to our cabin and I'll tell you my story about Tahiti while we wait until we get out to sea and have to raise the sails," Boatswain Damon said. Will turned and followed his new friend down the ladder to their cabin. "I guess the next adventure in my life is beginning," Will thought, smiling to himself. When they got to the cabin, Boatswain Damon pulled a couple of chairs up to a large wooden barrel that had two wide bands of metal straps around it. The barrel served as a table that the boatswain put 2 cups and a bottle of apple cider on. He filled the 2 cups half full and said, "Sit down, matey, and let me tell you about that wonderful island of Tahiti." Will pulled his chair closer to the table and waited intently for the story to begin. "To understand the beauty of Tahiti, you must appreciate its history and the people of this island," Boatswain Damon said. Tahiti is the largest island of French Polynesia in the archipelago of Society Islands of the South Pacific. The island consists of 2 parts, centered on volcanic mountains and connected by a short isthmus. The northwestern part is known as Tahiti Nui, or Big Tahiti, and the southeastern part is smaller and is known as Tahiti Iti, or Small Tahiti. The island was settled by Polynesians from Tonga and Samoa between 300 and 800 AD, or even earlier. Samuel Wallis was considered the first European to visit in 1767, followed by the French explorer Louis Antoine de Bougainville in 1768, when he was sailing around the world in his ship the Bordeaux. "I know this is important history," Will said, "but when were you there?" "I'm getting to that, matey," the boatswain patiently said as he continued. "After Captain James Cook visited the island in 1774, European ships started coming quite frequently. These visitors unfortunately brought with them diseases that killed many Tahitians. Later in the 1700s, I'd say around 1789, a ship known as the HMS Bounty landed in Tahiti. My friend Cookie told me a little about that story of the Bounty that he said Captain Hawkins had told him. Wasn't it a ship from England that Fletcher Christian, the master's mate led some of the crew to mutiny against Captain Bligh?" Will asked. "Yes, the captain and his loyal sailors were put adrift in the open sea until they were rescued, while some of the crew that mutinied went to Tahiti," the boatswain said. "A lot of history took place on that island, but for the people one of the most significant events was when King Pomer V was forced to cede or give up the sovereignty of Tahiti to France in 1880. It was the following year that I arrived and fell in love with not only this lush, pretty island, but the people as well, especially Kenyatta." "This is beginning to really get interesting," Will said, smiling in anticipation for what the boatswain had to say next. He looked over at the photograph of the beautiful island girl sitting on the shelf. She was a distant relative of King Pomer's second wife, Queen Joanna Mara'utaroa Tipaua Salmon, Boatswain Damon said. "Kenyatta was a lovely girl who was always happy and had an innocence about her that was very sweet. We fell in love immediately and were inseparable while our ship was docked. One evening Kenyatta and I went up on Mount Orohina to watch the sunset. While she lay in my arms in the tall grass on the mountainside, I made my decision that I would stay and marry her." "Will I get to meet her when we get there?" Will asked enthusiastically. "Unfortunately you won't," Boatswain Damon said sadly. "She died shortly after from smallpox, which he had gotten from one of our crew members. Needless to say, I swore I would never return to that island, but it looks like I will be going again." Will could see tears beginning to stream down the boatswain's face as he looked at the photograph on the shelf. Both men sat there without saying a word when suddenly a knock on the cabin door broke the silence. "Come in," Boatswain Damon ordered, quickly regaining his composure. "Sir, we are approaching the open sea and it's time to raise the sails," Seaman Joseph said as he stood in the doorway. "We're coming," Will told Joseph. "You can show me one of my duties, Boatswain. I always wondered how to raise the sails," Will said. Will knew that getting the boatswain's mind back on the ship would get it off the sadness he experienced from reliving the past. When the two men reached the deck, Boatswain Damon immediately took charge and started blowing on his boatswain's whistle. The different notes and pitches of the whistle would indicate instructions to the crew of when to hoist sails, haul, or let go of the ropes. While helping to raise the sails, Will learned the ship's masts are named from bow to stern, front to back, and that the names of the sails depended on which mast they were attached to. For example, the foresail gets its name from the foremast, which is the first mast. The mainsail is on the main mast, which is the tallest and is located near the center of the ship. The third tallest is the mizzen mast and has the mizzen sail and is immediately after the mainmast. Once all the sails were raised, the speed of the flying clipper increased dramatically as it hit its south. Will and Boatswain Damon went to join Captain Hawkins on the bridge where he was guiding his ship through the open sea. "Everything is in order, Captain. Is there anything else you require?" the boatswain asked. "No, thank you. You two may retire to your cabin for the night so you can get a good sleep because there will be a lot to do on this voyage," the captain said. He was right. Will and the rest of the crew were busy every day as they made various stops along the American coast. They traded while they went, but they saved most of the lumber they had loaded in New York for the people in the West Indies. The West Indies is a group of islands that extends from southern Florida to the coast of Venezuela. The explorer Christopher Columbus gave these islands the name West Indies in 1492 when he assumed they were near the coast of India. The Bahamas, the Greater Antilles, and the eastern and southern islands of the Lesser Antilles are the four island chains that make up the West Indies. Spain and France called the islands the Antilles after the mythological Atlantic island of Antilia or Antilla. The larger islands of Cuba, Jamaica, Hispaniola, and Puerto Rico became known as the Greater Antilles. The smaller islands like Martinique, Grenada, St. Vincent, St. Kitts, Antigua, the Virgin Islands, and others became known as the Lesser Antilles. Will enjoyed every moment of this adventure, and even though there was not a lot of time for sightseeing at the various ports, he still had the opportunity to meet a lot of people. When the ship made its scheduled stops in the Caribbean, Will was struck by the poverty he encountered on some of the islands. He asked some of the islanders the reason for this, and they said the Slavery Abolition Act of 1833. This emancipation of the former enslaved by the British Empire took effect on August 1st, 1834, when all countries under the rule of England could no longer legally have slaves. Without this cheap source of labor, sugarcane production declined, and the economies of the islands were devastated. The populations continued to increase, but the import and export trade decreased, affecting living conditions. Some governments did not want to invest in these islands because they didn't think they could make money without the use of slave labor. The people, however, were happy because freedom to them was the most important thing in the world. Will gained a new respect for the freedom he and his family had enjoyed in Canada and the economic opportunities they had been given. Traveling along the South American coast, he encountered other people experiencing some of the same problems as the islands, but again the people were very happy, and to them life was wonderful. Boatswain Damon had said that Will would learn a lot about sailing, and he was right. He now knew his way around the ship as well as any of the crew members, and he performed his duties with the expertise of a seasoned seaman. After a couple of months, they finally left their last South American port in Argentina, with the next stop to be San Francisco. Will was assisting some of the crew in weighing the anchor when Boatswain Damon came to him. "Matey, the captain wants you to join him on the bridge. I will take over your duties here on deck." Will gave the boatswain the anchor's rope and then hurried to meet the captain. "Captain Hawkins, you wanted to see me?" Will asked as he entered the bridge. "Yes, seaman," the captain said. "I hear you are becoming quite the sailor, so I wanted to prepare you for the next part of our voyage. When we sail around Cape Horn, the possibility of encountering rough seas, strong winds, large waves, and even icebergs will be greatly increased. The Cape is located at the southernmost part of Chile and is the major clipper route that carries trade around the world. It became very popular for passengers following the California gold rush in 1849. This route was considered to be the preferable method of getting to the west coast of the United States, rather than crossing the dangerous North American prairie. After the Transcontinental Railroad was completed, people took this safer and quicker method of train travel to cross the continent. But of course you know that because you told me you were there when the two railroads connected. The first to sail around the Cape in 1616 was the Dutch navigator Willem Cornelius Schouten, who named it for his birthplace, the city of Hoorn in the Netherlands. The English call it Cape Horn, and in Spanish they call it Capo de Hornos, but to us sailors it's simply known as the Horn. Sailing around it will be one of the major challenges on this journey, so I wanted you to be aware of the dangers we could face, the captain said. He continued, "Any location on Earth is described by its latitude and longitude. For example, the Horn is located at 55 degrees, 59 minutes, 00 seconds south, 067 degrees, 16 minutes, 00 seconds west. This is considered the dividing line between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans." "What do all the numbers mean?" Will asked. "It's complicated, and I suggest when we stop at one of the ports you come to my cabin and I can lend you a book that will explain it all. All of this knowledge is important to know, Will, in case you ever have to take over the helm," the captain said. The trip went smoothly. The sea was exceptionally calm and the weather was so good the captain was able to sail at over 20 knots, making it possible to get to San Francisco in record time. The only thing that could affect their progress would be the weather conditions at the tip of South America. On the third day after leaving their last port in Chile, the flying clipper was approaching the Horn, so Captain Hawkins began singing a sea shanty. "Ever since I was born I said I'd sail around the Horn. I never knew how hard that'd be until I rode that stormy sea. But around Cape Horn I'll take my ship to trade with others on this trip. I will not stop for wind or rain, and I'll sail the Horn once more again. Heidi-ho, heidi-hey, the flying clipper won't go away. Heidi-ho, heidi-hey, look out Cape Horn, I'm here to stay." Around sunset the bell was sounded, alerting all the crew to come on deck. When Will came from below he couldn't believe his eyes. Coming directly towards them from the southwest was a huge black funnel cloud, unlike anything he had ever seen before. Even though the sky was still sunny and the center of the storm had not yet reached them, The sea was swirling around, tossing the ship from side to side. None of the men had to be given orders because they knew what they had to do. They began lowering the sails so there would be less resistance to the oncoming wind. Others either tied down any loose items on deck or took them below. Seaman Matthew and Joseph went below to close all the portholes and batten down the hatches. The wind was really beginning to pick up, and now the clipper was being spun around almost out of control. You could see the captain on the bridge battling the storm, refusing to let her take his ship. The bow was dipping below the surface of the ocean as the ship was bobbing up and down. A couple of sailors were nearly washed overboard, but some crew members were able to throw them some ropes and pull them to safety. Everyone had done all they could topside, so they retreated below to ride out this horrific weather. Boatswain Damon, Seaman Matthew, and Seaman Joseph went to the engine room so they could help shovel extra coal. It was important to keep the engine running because it was their only source of power now since the sails had been lowered. Will decided he should get to the bridge and help Captain Hawkins. "Will, what are you doing up here? Get down below with the rest of the crew," the captain yelled so he could be heard above the sound of the wind. "I'm sorry, sir, but I thought you might need some help," Will shouted back. "Well, since you're staying, tie this rope around your waist so you don't get washed overboard. There might be times when it will take both of us to hold the helm steady," the captain said. The gale was growing worse, and you could hear the ship straining against the pressure. The wind's fury was heightened even further when it became laced with hail and sleet. Lightning streaked across the sky, illuminating the two figures tied to the helm as they valiantly battled the violent storm. The men, however, were unafraid. It had become obvious they were determined to stand their ground because their life and the life of the crew now depended on it. The captain began singing his sea shanty again, and Will began singing with him. Moments later, the captain spotted a cove just ahead and to the right, so he signaled to Will, and together they grabbed the helm. With all their strength, they steered the ship in that direction. Fortunately, Boatswain Damon and the others were below, continuing to feed coal into the engine, giving them enough power to limp into the snug little bay. Even though they were out of reach of the worst part of the storm and the water was still pretty rough, at least they were provided with some protection. Boatswain Damon and other crew members immediately came up on deck and dropped anchor. After lowering the anchor, the boatswain entered the bridge. "Captain Hawkins, Will, are you two okay?" he asked with concern. "Yes," the two answered weakly, exhausted by their ordeal. "Please, sir, let me relieve you so you and Will can go below and get some rest. The other men and I can take over now. The storm is not as bad in this cove, and by morning she should subside. We can remain anchored until then, and hopefully it will be easier to check the ship for damages," Boatswain Damon suggested. "That's a good idea. It did take a lot out of us fighting that storm. Come on, Will, let's take a break," the captain said. The two of them left the bridge and went to their respective cabins. When Will woke up the following morning, the storm was over. The ship had received very little damage, and after the repairs had been made, the flying clipper sailed 37 degrees 46 minutes 0 seconds north, 122 degrees 26 minutes 0 seconds west to the port city of San Francisco. San Francisco is located on the tip of the San Francisco Peninsula. The earliest evidence of people in that area dates to 3000 BC. A group of Native Americans, the Yelano of the Ohlone people, lived there in villages. When Mexico became independent from Spain in 1821, San Francisco became part of their territory. In 1848, the city and the rest of California officially became American territory with the signing of the Treaty of Guadalupe, which ended the Mexican-American War. Shortly after, the California gold rush brought thousands of fortune seekers, raising the population from 1,000 in 1848 to 25,000 by 1849. California was admitted to the United States as the 31st state on September 9, 1850. Almost 50 years later, the San Francisco that Will was going to visit was still flourishing. The Transcontinental Railroad and the coastal location of this city made it a natural center for trade, especially with the Far East now being open for American merchants. "Did you know the clipper ships were virtually created because of San Francisco?" Boatswain Damon asked Will one day as they were repairing one of the sails. "No, I didn't. How could a city influence the development of ships like ours?" Will asked. Boatswain Damon explained, "You know, matey, that fast ships were necessary to carry goods great distances. Since San Francisco has so much trade coming into her port, merchants come there from all over the world. This forced competition among shipbuilders to provide the fastest ships they could. The design of the Clipper would have to meet the specifications of the captains that would sail them. I know Captain Hawkins must be happy with the design changes he made to the Flying Clipper," Will said. "Despite the problems we had at the Horn, the captain said it looks like we will get to San Francisco from New York in excellent time." Later on that day, the captain congratulated Will on surviving the trip going west around the Horn. But he said traditionally a sailor only gets to wear a gold loop earring in the left ear and also dine with one foot on the table when traveling east. Will didn't know when they returned east around the Horn whether he would ever wear the gold earring or not. One thing he did know, he thought, smiling to himself, if he ever put his foot on his mother's table, he would likely lose not only his foot, but his whole leg. When they landed in San Francisco, Will found it to be a bustling city. There was a large community of Chinese who had worked on the Transcontinental Railroad, and Will met some of his old friends. They invited him to their home for dinner, where they laughed and talked about the first time they came to the cookie car in Promontory, Utah. Will remembered how they had to teach him and Cookie their language and the proper way to cook Chinese food. They said they didn't mind at all because in exchange for sharing their recipe secrets, Cookie told them some of the secret ingredients he used that made his dishes famous among all the railroad men. Later that evening, he said goodbye to his friends and returned to the ship, where he told Boatswain Damon about his day. They stayed in San Francisco for 2 weeks while the captain and the boatswain bargained for goods they could take with them to trade in the Far East. Once the ship had been fully loaded, the captain had the boatswain call all men on deck. "Men, we're loaded, ready to weigh anchor and head to China. We will stop in Tahiti for a few days to get more fresh water and food supplies. Boatswain Damon, please set our course for 17 degrees 40 minutes south, 149 degrees 30 minutes west, to Tahiti, the center of the Polynesian Triangle," the captain ordered. The voyage across the Pacific Ocean was busy as usual, and the weather was good except for a few small rain squalls. After surviving the Horn, the crew knew they could handle any storms. During the trip, as they came closer to reaching Tahiti, Will noticed Boatswain Damon seemed to become a little more withdrawn. He knew the memories of Kenyatta must have been flooding back. When they finally landed in this Pacific paradise, the crew became very excited. They could hardly wait for their shore leave, when they would have an opportunity to interact with the friendly people on the island. While waiting for the gangplank to be dropped, Will looked around for the boatswain. He could not be found, so Will went to their cabin where his friend was laying face down on his bunk. "Aren't you going ashore, boatswain?" Will asked. "No," came the boatswain's muffled reply. "Come on, since you're familiar with the island, I thought perhaps you could show me around. I would really like to visit Mount Orohina, where you used to go with Kenyatta," Will said, trying to encourage his friend. Boatswain Damon looked up at Will, then slowly sat up on the edge of his bunk. He knew that Will was trying to make him feel better, and even though he was sad, he appreciated Will's concern. "Okay, I'll come, matey," the boatswain said, "but I really don't want to talk about her." "Great," Will agreed. "I'll wait for you on the dock at the bottom of the gangplank." 10 minutes later, Boatswain Damon joined him, and the two men headed to the mountain. The vegetation was lush rainforest, and they only met a few natives on the way because the direction they went was quite isolated. This suited Boatswain Damon just fine. The two of them spent most of the day on the mountainside while the boatswain explained the names and medicinal qualities of some of the plants. He never asked, but Will figured a lot of this knowledge the boatswain had learned from Kenyatta. When they came down from the mountain, there seemed to be a physical change in his friend. He was smiling now and was in a lot better mood. "Let me take you to the Matei village, matey, where I have friends and we can get something to eat," the boatswain said. Will was surprised when they arrived in the village that so many people seemed to know his friend. One of the older ladies grabbed the boatswain by the arm, then took him and Will into her house. "You must eat here at my home," the woman said in a combination of Tahitian and French language that the boatswain had to interpret for Will. The meal she served them was delicious and included exotic dishes Will had never heard of before. During their stay, the boatswain and their host were engaged in constant conversation, and even though Will couldn't understand a word either was saying, he could tell they seemed to have something in common. He learned later that the woman was Kenyatta's mother. That evening, back on the ship, as the two of them lay on the bunks in their cabin, the boatswain said, "This has been a good day for me, matey, because you encouraged me to leave my bed. My heart now has begun to heal. Thank you, my friend." The next morning it was the boatswain who woke Will up. "Let's go, matey, it's time to go ashore." Will was so happy to see his friend back to being his old self. He showed Will around the rest of Tahiti, teaching him some of the language as they walked. Later they went back to Matei village to eat at Kenyatta's mother's home again. After they had eaten, she took them next door to meet her new neighbor. "Hello, Paul, are you home?" Kenyatta's mother called out. "Yes, I'm in the courtyard out back," the man replied. The three visitors went around to the back of the house where they found a man sitting in front of an easel with a paintbrush in his hand. Kenyatta's mother introduced Will and Boatswain Damon to her friend, Paul Gauguin. The three of them talked in the native language, and while they did, Will wandered around the courtyard looking at Paul's paintings. There were several paintings, some completed and some that were partially finished. There was a painting of two women on the beach and others showing different scenes of Tahitian life. Will never knew very much about art, other than either he liked the picture or he didn't. He felt that Paul's paintings were unique, and Will was very impressed. They visited with Paul until it was time for Will and Boatswain Damon to leave. After saying goodbye, they walked Kenyatta's mother back to her house, then they returned to the ship. "What an interesting day," Will said. "Yes, it was, matey," Boatswain Damon said, "and Paul Gauguin is a very interesting character. I know you couldn't understand what we were talking about, but I'll tell you everything when we're back in our cabin. I can tell you Paul is from France, and he just moved here last year. He said he came to Tahiti to escape European civilization and everything that is artificial and conventional. He stayed on the island of Martinique in the Bahamas for a while, and even worked as a laborer on the Panama Canal." When they got back to the ship, the boatswain told Will the rest of what he learned about Paul. Hearing the story made Will think of his family, and for the first time since this voyage began, he realized how much he missed them. The Flying Clipper left Tahiti 2 days later, and the captain set their course for China. While they were docked in China, Will had an opportunity to deliver some packages and mail that his Chinese friends in San Francisco had asked him to give to their family. Boatswain Damon went with him, and because Will knew how to speak Chinese, this time he had the opportunity to translate for the boatswain. The people they met were very happy to receive news of their relatives in America, and they welcomed the two men into their homes. They fed them and then took them for a 2-day tour of their country. First they went to the Great Wall of China, and on the way they passed many villages where they saw people working in the rice fields. They were told the Great Wall is over 4,000 miles long and goes from the Shanghai Pass in the east to Lop Nur in the west, and is the longest human-made structure in the world. It is a series of fortifications built between the 5th century BC and the 16th century to keep out China's enemies. Finally, in 1644, the Manchus were able to cross the Great Wall at the gates of the Shanghai Pass. They quickly captured Beijing and defeated the Shun dynasty. The Manchus then established the Qing dynasty and extended China's borders by annexing Mongolia. Once that happened, China no longer needed to defend their borders, so they didn't have to maintain the Great Wall. Will and the boatswain were fascinated, and both of them understood now why the Chinese were a culture to be admired and respected. They thanked their new friends for their hospitality and for the tour of their great country. Later, they returned back to the dock to assist with the loading of the ship. When the Flying Clipper's hold was filled with tea, silk, and other goods, the anchor was immediately raised. The return trip to New York went a lot faster because they didn't have to make as many stops. The majority of their cargo was destined for the East Coast markets of the United States, and it was imperative they get the goods to the vendors as quickly as possible to prevent them from becoming spoiled. When they arrived in New York, the crew was happy to be back in the United States. After emptying the cargo hold, the seamen took a leave to visit their family and friends. Captain Hawkins, Boatswain Damon, Will, Seaman Matthew, and Joseph were the only ones that remained on board. "Once the ship is loaded for the next voyage, I think I'm going to return home," Will said to the boatswain. "This has been one of the best experiences in my life, but it's time for me to settle down." "I understand," Boatswain Damon told him. "I want you to know that you have been an excellent mate, and I'm sure Captain Hawkins and the rest of the crew will agree." Will went and told Seaman Matthew and Joseph his decision to go home, and like the boatswain, they were sad to see he was leaving. Will found the captain in his cabin where he was looking over his maps, plotting the course for their next trading voyage. Although the door was open, Will knocked anyway to get the captain's attention. "Come in, Will, let me show you where we're going next," Captain Hawkins said as he beckoned Will to his side. Will leaned over the table as the captain tapped 3 spots on the map with his index finger. "Europe, Africa, India," was all he said.